Well, hello, everyone. I'm Clinton, and I'm going to be your moderator for this panel, The History of Podcasting Project. In a few minutes, I'll be introducing all of these. Rule number one, don't hit the microphone. All of these people that are with me on the panel. But I'd like to start off with kind of setting the tone of what we're talking about here as far as the History of Podcasting Project, at least in this initial phase. And I want to start it off with a story that a friend of mine reminded me about. And it's a friend of mine, T. Morris. He was reading an article in Wired magazine. And the article was entitled, "Fiction Podcasts Are Finally a Thing. Thank You, Sci-Fi and Horror." Now, he was all excited to read this article about podcasting and everything. He came across this sentence. Years after Welcome to Night Vale first defined the genre, fictional podcasts have finally arrived. Now, the problem is that Night Vale came out in 2012, and people like Merle Lafferty, Scott Siegler, Mercedes Lackey, J.C. Hutchins, and even T. Morris were podcasting their fiction back as early as 2004. So what we're talking about here is the fact that the early days of podcasting, especially where there wasn't a lot of documentation because media wasn't covering podcasting at that point, because they were asking the same question your neighbor was, what's a podcast? So the focus of the History of Podcasting Project, and you can find this over at the website, says in part, a grassroots organization made up of pioneering podcasters going back to 2004, including the precursors before the new medium took shape. The mission of History of Podcasting is to tell the true story of the early days of podcasting by the people who made it happen. That's a tall order. So we're going to cover what we can in the course of 50 minutes on the panel. So I'd like to start by introducing the panelists. Now, in my head, there is a table that we're all sitting at. I know it doesn't look like it, but in my head, there is. And so I have an order of where everybody is sitting because that's just the way my mind works. So I'm going to start at the far end of the table and work my way across. And what I'd like each person to do when I call on them is to obviously say your name, when you started podcasting, and what the name of your first podcast was, if you'd like to share that as well. And hopefully you will. So at the very end of the table, way down there, is Mr. Craig Stepp.
Well, you got me way down here.
I'm sorry.
So I'm Craig Stepp. I've been podcasting since 2005 with Chuck Tomasi. We do Technorama, and we started in May of 2005. So,
okay. And what was the first thing that you podcasted then? Was that Technorama? Or?
Yeah, it was Technorama. In 2004, when I first got into podcasting, I started helping other podcasters with album art or, producing audio and stuff. But really, that was the first podcast was with Chuck on Technorama.
Okay, cool. Next, we have Tyra.
Hi, I started podcasting about a dozen years or so ago. My first podcast was Leveling Azeroth, which is all about leveling in the world of Warcraft. So I joined the gamer podcast crew then.
Okay, very good. And next to me on this side is Bobby.
Yeah, so my name is Bobby Blackwolf. I started my first and only podcast, but I've done like some one-offs, but my main podcast called The Bobby Blackwolf Show because I didn't think I was going to do it all that long, but I started in July of 2005, back when there were only like 50 video game podcasts out there. It was like a month after iTunes added podcasts is when I got in. And now I'm competing with 50,000 people, but I've been doing it every week and I'm 720 episodes in.
There you go. Excellent. I'm sitting sort of towards the middle here. So I've already introduced myself as Clinton. I started podcasting in June of 2005, made it into the wire before iTunes got into the game. And the podcast that I started with is the same one that I'm still doing today, Comedy Forecast. All right. And on the other side, first next to me is Sue. Oh, and we don't hear Sue.
Muted because
there we
cats.
Go.
Hi. I guess I'm the newbie of the group. I started guesting on podcasts around 2008 and became a regular podcaster in 2010. My first show was Anomaly Supplemental, part of the Anomaly podcast. And I currently am on Women at Warp on the Roddenberry Podcast Network.
Excellent. And way down at the other end is Drew.
Hey, how you doing? I'm Drew Domkis. I've been podcasting since September 23rd, 2004. And that show was called The Dawn and Drew Show, and it's still sort of alive. We've done 1,092 episodes, but we definitely don't put them out as often as we used to.
All right. And I wanted to mention right here that Drew is currently working on the History of Podcasting website itself. I know right now we have up a splash page, if you will, with the mission statement and a submission form that you're looking for. Now we're talking about podcasters that may be between those first couple of years, 2004, 2008 at this point.
We opened it up. We started with just a couple first 2 years, but now we've opened it up to 2008 to just try to get more content into the site before we kind of dress it up and display all the information that we're getting.
Okay, excellent. And obviously we'll let people know when that actually happens. I'm sure you'll hear about it all over.
Yeah.
I was going to say all over the potosphere. Now, how long has it been since we've heard that phrase, the potosphere? Oh my goodness gracious.
Last week.
Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, all right. Well, that's
awesome.
That's good to know. That's very good. But it might have been me that said it to Craig. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So my first question is going to be a toss up to people because I want you to go way back. Some people go way, way back. Some people go way back. And that's okay because I wanted to have a perspective of just like in that article, things change so fast in podcasting. I wanted to see people's experiences as they got into the medium. We're talking about initial history of podcasting, but how was that morphing? So the toss-up is, when did you first hear about podcasting and how did you hear about it? Did you hear about it from a friend? Did you read an article? Because in the very early days, obviously, as I said, there weren't a lot of news stories about podcasting. So you had to have heard about it somehow. And I know it wasn't on Twitter because there was no Twitter back then. So who would like to say how you even heard about podcasting way back then?
I don't mind going first. I might be the earliest, but I was working at a design firm. It was a design firm and a magazine all in one building. And the guy that I was helping, my coworker, is Pete Pradell, who started Raster Web Audio. And he's still kind of out there. He never really sticks with a certain thing, but that was the first show I ever heard. And because we were cube mates in a way, he kind of just got me into blogging and then into podcasting because of that natural progression, because we were both now listening to Dave Weiner and Adam Curry, kind of creating the whole process as it happened. And so that's when I first heard about it. That would have been, early, it was right around September, if not August of 2004. I don't even know if it was called podcasting yet.
Right. That kind of came a little bit later on.
It was right in that frame. We didn't know what we were calling it. We were just attaching audio to a blog post. And, whoever subscribed to your blog was going to get an MP3.
Whether they liked it or not.
Whether they liked it or not, yeah. There was no Twitter, no Facebook. There was a lot of aggregators, however you were looking at your blogs, if you aggregated them or however you were doing it back then, an MP3 was going to pop up. And that's how it all started. We just tested a file and then it was there. And then that's just how it all began.
Right. It was so rudimentary at the beginning that it's kind of hard to fathom now how it has changed and everything else has changed.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the very beginning, it's kind of there is nothing and then there is something and that something has to have its origin. Anyone else want to share how they even heard about it? Craig, I saw your hand up.
Yeah. So real briefly, I was reading Slashdot, and I think it was like in the fall of 2004, and I remember reading the article. I went, whoa, podcasting, and I had to back up, and I was like, what is that? And that just kind of led me to Adam Curry. I listened to his show, probably a few of them actually, and then he mentioned Dave Slusher of Evil Genius Chronicles, and I went, what's that? So I went and listened to him, and Dave was talking about he lived in Conway, South Carolina. I live in South Carolina, and that blew my mind because I went from the Netherlands to Conway, South Carolina, just listening to a podcast. And on Dave's show, he started mentioning Kevin Devin, who did In the Trenches, which was an IT-centric podcast, and how his first podcast sounded like he was about to give up on podcasting. So I was like, I'm going to go listen to this guy. So I went and I contributed some with Kevin, and that's how I got pulled into it. So I went looking for that article on Slashdot. I don't know where it's at, but if it wasn't for me just catching that little word, I guess it had been a while before I get into it. So.
Okay. Anyone else have an origin story? Sue?
Yeah, I think the precursor to podcasting for me was that mythical time of internet radio, right? So the early 2000s, to date myself, I was in college, and our college radio station moved online, right? And then I think that was the sort of mind-blowing moment for me of I can listen to the radio on the internet, because my family was a radio family, which I don't think was like a thing anymore, but it still was for us. But, and I remember just searching for like internet radio stations. Live 365 happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then after receiving, because I went mini disc player first, but after purchasing my first iPod and downloading iTunes, I went in there and I was like, what is this podcast tab? And I have a very distinct memory of like 2005, clicking on this podcast tab and being like, the shows can come to me whenever I want them to. And it sounds silly, but it was a bit of a life-changing experience.
No.
And I spent all night, if not all weekend, like searching for podcasts on all of my interests. And I went from 0 to 500 really in terms of listenership. I'm the listener who downloads an entire back catalog and plows through it all. I am that person.
Oh, you're the person.
Yeah. Me all the time.
Suddenly I had like 5,000 hits on my show the other day. And it's one person saying, I'm just taking them all today.
Yep.
Very sad the next day, it's just back to normal again.
And I can kind of piggyback on that a little bit, because I also was in the Live 365 ecosystem and stuff. And I think I first heard about it in 2004. I think I probably saw it in a Slashdot article because it was my homepage at the time as well. But I had some guilt over not doing the college radio station when I had the chance. And so I was like, well, Live 365 allows me to be a DJ and I can do a talk show. And I was in video game community. So in 2004, I actually did a weekly live talk show on Live 365. And somebody asked me, hey, are you going to make this a podcast? And I said, I hate Apple. I'm not going to do that. I don't care about your iPods. Then I got myself an iPod Classic. And this was before the integration with the iTunes integration. So I had some third party thing that would inject the podcast into my iPod. And I started listening to like some local Atlanta ones. I probably listened to Leo Laporte, This Week in Tech around that time, number 1, number 2, in those first early days. And that's when I started listening. And I'm like, any idiot with a mic can do this. Wait, I'm an idiot and I have a mic.
You're in good company.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you decided you were going to podcast, again, we're talking about pretty early on. Did you have any resources that you could go to? I mean, obviously, Drew was talking about that he got into, as Adam Curry and Dave Weiner are kind of working through things on like the daily source code and so forth, trying to figure out how this works. So you're seeing really how the sausage is made at that point. But there were some early books about how to do stuff. Todd Cochran had written one, and T. Morris and Evo Terra had written one. Did you go to resources like that? Did you go to ask the podcasters who are already doing stuff? How did people learn how to podcast?
If I could take this one first, I think,
Sure.
I think it's a somewhat unique experience in that I, at least with the Anomaly podcast, which existed before me, I became a frequent fan interactor. I wrote emails, I engaged on social media, what there was of it at that point. And when they started to expand, the host invited me to be a blogger. And then when they wanted guests on the show, they invited their bloggers on. So it was at the very beginning, I was given step-by-step, download Skype, download call recorder, there's a very early, like, basic stuff. Here's a decent microphone if you want to do more. And then Anomaly expanded more, and they asked me to do a regular show within the feed. And throughout the years spent on that show and then creating a new show, I picked up more, and I learned in a bit of a mentorship way, from people who were already doing it and were maybe a couple years ahead in terms of, we've gone through this already, here's how we handled it. And then, to be honest, more recently, especially if you're starting out, I think a lot of the Facebook groups that exist now for podcasting can be very, very helpful. But I'm not sure I would have kept going if I hadn't had the one-on-one with creators that I already knew and trusted, because it wasn't being a woman on the internet. It was a safe space to ask questions and not be written off as stupid or looking for attention or trying to get money, which happens a lot.
Right. Well, I'll share quickly. My story of it is that I basically figured that, well, let's take a look at an RSS file from something that I've downloaded. And I went, oh, this is relatively easy to do. Now, this is the days before iTunes got involved, and suddenly everything had another tag attached to it. And I think Apple was the people that introduced the explicit tag at that point. But at that point, you had your basic main feed and then your items for the enclosures, and it was relatively simple. And the source that I went to was Rob Walsh of Podcast 411 had a page where he just kind of broke down what this RSS feed is.
I remember that page.
And that was my source to go to figure out how to do it.
I think our biggest hurdle at the very beginning was bandwidth. Nobody was hosting big MP3s, and it was a bit of a punishment to become popular, because where were you going to host your files? There were no services like Libsyn or anything like that. And even still to today, I still host all my own files. But at the very beginning, we were, getting these huge bills for hosting, and why are you sucking up all our bandwidth? And it was at those beginning days where, I know we were talking earlier about like Adam Curry and like maybe some of the network kind of stuff, but that was like a bit of a lifesaver for us, because we couldn't afford, hosting the show that was getting millions of downloads a month. It was just impossible. And so we ended up joining up with Podshow at that time, and then they were hosting all our files. So that was definitely our biggest hurdle at the very beginning, because there was no hosting package for podcasters, or it just didn't exist.
Right. And oh yes, go ahead, Tyra.
I was just going to say, I think that really plays into how important community has been in the podcast world without the community of podcasters, because you can walk up to somebody. I talked to Ibid at a bar once about a problem we were having at DragonCon, and he went on for an hour trying to help us. And that's true, I think, of most of the podcasting community. When somebody tells me, I'm thinking of doing a podcast, I'm like, find a Discord group, join the digital track at DragonCon. Because the first place that I got information was actually at a podcasting panel at DragonCon. And it was small. We were in a small room as part of the EFF track, and you went to the one podcasting panel they had, and everybody shared. And I think I don't know that it's unique, but it's unique enough in this day and age that we have such a welcoming community that helps each other.
Well,
yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Bobby.
Yeah, and I was kind of self-taught. Because I'm a software developer by trade and stuff. So I basically was like, okay, I'm just going to reverse engineer what everybody else is doing. And so like I looked at an RSS feed, and for the first, I think 3 years of my show, I hand edited the XML feed. Yeah. I eventually wrote a website and that I still actually use today that actually generates what I would normally hand edit. But I was hand editing the RSS feed and I was self-hosting, and luckily I didn't get millions of downloads, so I didn't have to worry about too big of a hosting bill. But also I was doing things a little bit differently than everybody else anyway, because I was still doing the live 365 type of thing. And so I was teaching myself not only how to podcast, but also how to do the live internet radio streaming using Shoutcast is actually what we had moved to in 2005, but also using Skype to take live calls, which I was doing 2005. I had a live chat room at the same time and date that I do now. It was on Sunday nights at 8 Eastern. And I was doing all that in 2005, and there weren't anybody else doing that, so I couldn't ask that many questions. But I think there probably was a live journal group or something that I went into for podcasting at the time, because we didn't have Twitter or Facebook or anything.
There's
right.
random message boards where maybe some of those.
The Podcast Pickle and Podcast Alley message boards and stuff. Yeah.
Right. We're talking about community, and I know it's a question or a comment about networks, and then we'll get to networks in a bit as well. But piggybacking off of something about community, we talked about this, the Pickle and the Alley, the two places that lots of podcasters would go. So if you aren't familiar with either of those places that don't really exist anymore, which is kind of hard to believe, but it's true. They were a combination of forums and a directory and a voting system about, who was best. And they each had their own different vibe to them, most certainly. I guess it's unfair to ask, who was Team Pickle and who was Team Alley, but what do you remember most about those type of days of communicating with the podcasters? Because to be honest, I think really early on, because how else could it be otherwise, you would find that a lot of the people that listened to your show were fellow podcasters. And so everybody kind of knew each other and knew of their show if they didn't listen to it all the time. So what were your impressions of like going into the forums and so forth? And did you encourage people to vote for you on the Pickle or on the Alley for your show to get it up in the rankings?
I was more of a message board guy, but as soon as Dawn figured out that it was the top 10 popularity contest, we just gamed that first place spot for I don't know how many weeks, months, years. I don't know. That was a blast. It just brought so much attention to us because us being on the top, if any news source came to look at podcasting, they'd look at us at the top. We got so much news, so much media because of that top 10 list. Not so much of the Pickle, but because of Podcast Alley. I'm friends with Gary, and I was at both places. But like that Podcast Alley top 10 was so ridiculous. It was such a junior high school crap. It was so silly, but it got us so much attention.
Yeah, because I think early on, a lot of podcasters, it was really a grassroots where podcasts were listening to other podcasters and kind of built on itself before Twitter and stuff came into play.
Absolutely.
And then the words got out. So, but yeah, those places were fantastic. I couldn't get, one of my two listeners to vote for us. So I couldn't crack the top 10, but
that listener was you, I think, wasn't it? Yeah, that's really weird.
No, we'll talk about that later. But no, I had a great time on those message boards. And it was good information or good information. It was good to be able to connect with other people because, because of we had the expo coming up and people were talking about other podcasts we were doing, and it was kind of grassroots. And I think that if we didn't have that early on, I don't think we would have had that great community. If it was just like boom and it was there, but it kind of grew and a lot of us know each other. And I think that those were invaluable, both those places. And I was team both. How about that?
Okay.
Now, one thing I kind of want to say is coming from the video game side, it was really interesting to me that video game podcasters we had our own communities. We were on like Xbox forums and PlayStation forums because I remember, I'm an Atlanta native. I've been coming to DragonCon since in the 20th century. But when I would come to the very early podcasting track, very early on, like the first year it came around, I was the only video game person podcaster at the track, because video game podcasters would convene at E3 or at other gaming conventions, and that's where that community would be. They didn't really bother with the rest of the podcasting landscape. We kind of had our own little bubble, our own little community, and we supported each other in those bubbles, but not many of us really branched out. That did change over the years, but in the beginning, we were kind of over here because video games foster a community, even, and especially that was when online gaming was really taking off with the consoles, Xbox Live coming out around that time. So we already had the built-in community, and so the podcast just bubbled up inside of that community instead of being in the podcast community.
Yeah, Warcraft was the same way. There was like its own little Warcraft podcasting community within the video game podcasting community.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't recall. I mean, I don't know. Very early on, well, there were video game podcasts that I do recall listening to, the World of Warcraft podcasts. Back in the day, but yeah, I don't think I remember seeing a lot of them at the shows. Which I was going to talk about the first podcast expos. If you were a podcaster back in 2005, before November, you pretty much were guaranteed that everybody's podcast was going to mention I'm going to or I can't go to the podcast expo in Ontario, California.
Yeah.
You know, so it was, everyone was so psyched, and then no, not so much so. Who was at the first expo? Just out of curiosity, show of hands. Okay, just wanted to set the bar on that. But I was thinking about one of the things that we talked about that Craig was mentioning, and about the early days of podcasting, and I was just having this weird thought that I don't think any of us realized, kind of in retrospect, what pressure we might have been under, that we were kind of proving something to happen. It was going to happen, or it wasn't going to happen, or it was going to be delayed for an awful long time if we just kind of messed the whole thing up and did things really weird. So good job, everybody here and everybody else who was doing it at the time. Good job. We made it. All right, but let's talk a bit about networks, because Drew was talking about networks, and there's a comment here from the chat. This is from Ranger Craig, who says, I remember attending a gathering where Adam Curry was trying to start a network, and weren't you there, Drew?
Yeah, and I was actually trying to remember, and I had put BloggerCon 06, but it was actually 04. It was that very first year.
Wow.
Yeah, where it was at Stanford, and they had a blogging panel every year. Dave Weiner was putting it on, and then they opened it up to podcasting. And that was like where Dawn and I took this chance. They'd invited us, Adam and Dave invited us to go and be a part of this thing. And, you know, we're just a couple of kids on this farm, didn't know what we're doing, put it all on a credit card, go to California, go and, you know, meet up with Adam Curry. It was a trip, but that was like the first time we met them. And that was where the kind of like all the seeds were kind of, you know, placed for Pod Show to become. It wasn't even called that then. It had a previous name, Mevio. No, Boku. Then Pod Show, then Mevio. And so it ran its course of names, but we initially talked with them about that, and it was throughout that next year. So I don't think we signed with them until 2006, I think it was. But that was that meeting that Craig was talking about, because that's where it all started. That's where the genesis for it was. But we had only initially met through our podcasts. You know, John and I would talk about Adam Curry talk about us. We'd mention Dave, Slusher, and Weiner. You know, Rock and Roll Geek Show. There was, you know, there was like 10 of us talking to each other through our shows, and that's just how it all happened for us to actually become part of Pod Show.
Right. Networks actually started fairly early on, which also kind of surprised me in some ways, looking back at it in retrospect. Not talking about so much just the type of, oh, these are all gamer podcasts, or these are all this type of, but, you know, actual networks. Now, some of the networks aren't around anymore. Were your shows always part of networks, or did you join networks pretty early on once you started your show? And did you have to approach the network, or did the network approach you?
Okay, well, I can go ahead and go first. So I was always on a network, and it was kind of because we grew up together. So when I started, I was on a network called the All Games Radio, the All Games Network or All Games Radio, because it was actually started by somebody who was a real pioneer of this in the 1990s. His name was Scott Rubin, and in the late 90s, he was part of the Pseudo Interactive Network, which was a real media streaming video network. Everything was like 240 by 120. It was about this big.
Generous. I think
yeah, it was a little bit. Yeah, I mean, my monitor's bigger now, so, but. It was one of those, and he was doing daily live streaming video, and you could watch them on demand about video games back then. He then went on to form this little television network called G4 in 2002. I kind of followed him there. I worked with the G4 as now we're moderating their social media, which wasn't a term back then, but I was doing that. And then when G4 kind of took over Tech TV, he didn't agree with it when that happened, and so he left. And it's like, the podcasting thing was new, and he's like, I want to start a podcast. I'm like, well, I can help with the tech side of that. So, because he also grew up in live radio, and so that's it. We kind of were together already, and so we just kind of formed it at that point, and then invited other video game podcasts that had started in 2004, 2005 to come join us on the network and share RSS feeds with the rest of our audience, and have kind of our own little gaming community that way.
Cool. Craig, your show is or was part of a tech network, isn't it?
Yeah. So it wasn't real. Yeah, it was more of a group, I guess. But it was a kind of a network. It was Friends in Tech, and there were several of us. I'm trying to run through all the shows in my head right now, but In the Trenches is one. Technorama was one, and we were all friends. Like I said, doing tech podcasts, and so Chuck and I were relying on a lot of our old school tech stuff, stories and things that we would find interesting about, it could be something somebody did stupid with a floppy drive, or maybe something we did stupid with a coupler modem. I don't know, things like that. And people were relating to it. But we had other podcasts, like I said, In the Trenches, and there was Steve Holden, who was doing I'm sorry, the name escapes me now. He was doing the tech news. And there were others, and it was just, we kind of, fed each other. It's like, oh, I saw this. Oh, I saw this. You might want to talk about it. And we kind of all built each other up. And then we did some fun stuff, like we tried to do roundtables and stuff like that. And then I got everybody together and did holiday specials. We did audio productions, and I'm still pulling my hair out thinking about some of the editing I did in Audacity with that. But it was a lot of fun, and we ended up dissolving because it just over a while it just didn't seem like a good fit, and some people had faded out, and so. But it was fun, and we're all still friends, of course. So yes.
Does anybody remember the 12 days of podcasting?
I do. I actually have it available on my hard drive.
Oh my gosh, really? I put that together.
You did that?
I did.
Wow.
Yeah. It was like, I just started hitting up all these original podcasters, just kind of put in that their verse, and then I don't know, it was one of my first editing feats, and I haven't heard it probably since then.
Yeah, one of the things I want to talk about was music on podcasts as well. Now, when people started podcasts, everybody just put everything out there, and some people were realizing, well, actually somebody's probably going to say, hey, that's licensed. You really shouldn't be doing that. And Brian Ibbett took like right away the tact of, I'm going to send them their money. They don't even, apparently I can't even talk to them, but I'm going to figure out and send them their money. But we had to come up with other ways to do it. So does anybody want to raise their hand about who kind of like skirted that whole issue and kind of did it anyway? No? Okay.
I think Michael Butler did as well.
Oh, I saw Tyra. You raised your hand there.
Well, we just went to musicians and asked. We went to independent musicians and said, can we use X song? And then we ended up with like 13 CDs that they made. And like, yes, use it as often as you want and as much. Matter of fact, Mark Gunn from the Bernardian Bards was one of the first people that sent us stuff. I think he's going to have a panel later on tomorrow here. So, but yeah, independent musicians, I don't know why people still don't use them. I think they're awesome.
Right, because we had rock stars early on, literally, we had Brother Love and Cruisebox, who very wisely for Cruisebox put out a song called Heard It on a Podcast. And everybody played that song. Of course, they had to have two versions because one wasn't really family friendly. So they had to have two versions of that. But then we had the pod, it was a pods, music.podshow.com for PodSafe Music.
PodSafe Music Network.
Yeah.
Now, I've done some stuff. I did as a Douglas Adams thing tribute. I got somebody to read the script and everything. And I wanted the music, the Journey of the Sorcerer that they played in the Hitchhiker's Guide show, and I found an artist online who did a version of it, and I asked him. It was like no problem, and which worked out really well. But there's other things like we're talking about the holiday specials. I spent hours. I knew what kind of music I wanted. I was trying to find the music I wanted without licensing or some kind of issue, and I spent hours looking for stuff. I wish it was a lot easier. I don't even know how easy it is today to license stuff like that.
It's a lot easier.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for telling me now. I'm just kidding.
We weren't much of a music podcast, but every now and then we would reach out to artists we liked and we would just hit them up and get their permission. And so we actually got Ziggy Marley on the PodSafe Music Network.
Wow.
We got Susan Vega on our show. We got, we're really good friends with Rasputina now. So like we would just kind of reach out to people we liked and they were pretty much into it.
Yeah. So for my intro and outro, I'm also a musician, and I was part of if anybody remembers the demo scene back in the 90s, PC demos, Amiga, stuff like that. I was in the music scene. I was a tracker at that time. So I pulled up my old tracking software and, made the intro and outro for my show. And I'm actually working on a new version of it that hopefully will come out sometime this year. We'll see. But what I wound up doing is because I was always a live show, I wanted to take a break and rest my voice. So I always have a music break kind of at the 30 to 40 minute mark of my 1 hour show. But I do that for the live feed, which has its own complications depending on what I'm playing. But I cut it out of the podcast. So the podcast audience just hears a couple scratches and then we come back in. So I used music for my live show and I just removed it out of the podcast, or I wrote it myself. Those are my two solutions.
I have always either asked an independent artist or commissioned one, which is another thing you could do, and pay people for something that is yours that you then own. But the audio that I have always been a little bit more anxious about, because my shows have always been media commentary shows, is that especially early on, it was very common to clip the show and play the audio of a scene or the audio of something. And, as podcasting became a bigger thing that more people paid attention to, we definitely pulled back on that. Like, I never got a claim. I never got like a C&D, but I started thinking like, maybe we should stop using a program called Audio Hijack.
Yeah.
The
name said it all. The name said it all right there.
Yeah, to grab audio and then release in the show. Even though, if we had the money and wanted to fight it, we were doing it for the purposes of commentary, which is allowed under the copyright law. But like, I don't have the money to fight that in court. So it's better, if possible, to just not.
Well, speaking about money, there were very early on not a lot of ways to be making money in podcasting, because obviously there was no GoFundMe, there was no Patreon, none of those things. Did you make money doing your podcast? And if so, how were you raising money for your podcast?
I got a funny story.
All right.
You guys remember Comic Strip Blogger? You remember that guy at all? He would always call in the Adam Curry show, and he had a really great voice. And he was he was really into mobile phones before there were smartphones, and he had this mobile phone company, and he was so into it. But he would hit us up every week because we were in that stupid top 10, and he would just try to figure out ways to give me some money to have me plug his mobile device website. And so got to the point where I would just make it a mention in the show, and he'd throw me $100. I might have been the first and maybe only to use the MP3 ID3 tag as an ad spot. It would say the name of our show, the title, something stupid about his mobile phone site. And it was crazy. So we made a few bucks back in the day, but then we obviously made money when Podshow signed us to a 3-year contract. But besides that, it was weird little things like that.
That's funny.
Anybody else have like a tip jar on their site? You could just like put a little bit of money in for that.
I've never made a single cent from podcasting, but we do, since we now broadcast, do the live recording on Twitch, we use Twitch subscriptions and bits, and those are kind of like tips and stuff. But that's from our live audience. I have not made a single cent from a podcast.
We have, or back in the day, Anomaly had a PayPal tip button or donate button. But I mean, now on Patreon, I guess it depends on how you defined make money, because I mean, our Patreon supports the show now. It helps us get to events. So we spend the money we take in on promotional materials, but neither I nor my co-hosts consider that profit. We're not making money. We're putting it back into the content that we're producing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I still haven't made money from podcasting.
I did do another show that lasted about 4 years, and it's been a few years since, but it was all about a friend and I would watch a movie, we'd get together, and we'd drink beer while we talked about the movie. And I actually had a liquor store that would supply us with 2 6-packs a week, kind of related to the name of the movie. So that was pay for sure. I got free beer for years. It was cool.
Standing outside, I would podcast for beer.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, I would say Chuck and I were approached by several. Well, we've had several people in the past, not recently, but we did some, little ads in the show and got a few dollars here and there. But I think Patreon's really been the big hitter for us. And when I say big hitter, we're not swimming or nothing, but it is helping keep the lights on and help us upgrade our software and stuff, which I know Chuck just did the other night. So it's been a big help. And and it really goes to show the listeners stepping up and helping out firsthand.
Okay. Somebody was mentioning in the chat here, certainly when I was talking about music, Jonathan Colton took a great advantage of podcasting early on. I mean, a brilliant marketing move that he did was September 2005 to September 2006. He put out a song every single week, just threw it out on the internet called the Thing a Week podcast.
Yep.
So everyone could use that stuff. And what did it do? It got his name out there everywhere, and everyone knew who Jonathan Colton was. So I think that promotion was definitely a thing that caught on very, very early on in podcasting. I have another question here that since we're getting close to the end, I want to cover one thing first, and I'm going to cover that. If we look at the panel here, we have 4 guys, kind of pale, and we have 2 women. I want to address this to the women. You touched a bit on this earlier, Sue. What has your experience in podcasting been positive, and has it always been positive? I mean, how do you what's your
Yes. So overall, very positive, right? But I am of the generation. I'm an older millennial, let's put it that way. So depending on where you draw your cutoff line, like I'm an ex-zennial or whatever the heck it is. But so I basically, the point in saying that is that I basically grew up on the internet. So I have experienced misogyny on the internet for as long as I have been on the internet. And sometimes I didn't realize it at the time. And definitely considered, like, I'm deciding to put myself out here, what's going to come back at me. And again, I had the advantage of starting in smaller spaces, right? Anomaly it's still out there, but it's not the world's biggest show. People don't know it. Now we're a little bit larger, but I was able to sort of test the waters in a way and see what kind of comments come back at me. But for the most part, it's been really great.
Good.
However, I've gotten death threats. Yeah, I've gotten podcast comments that are not about my content, but are about my voice or maybe a vocal fry or the way that I speak. It can be a lot, and you have to. What are the words? I think that a large portion of audiences are more willing to pick a fight with somebody who is not male on a show. So if they disagree with a male podcast host, they might just let it go. If they disagree with a woman podcast host, they're going to fight about it. They're going to try to belittle somebody or put them down. And yeah, I've sent some of the comments that we get to other hosts on the network, and I've just watched their jaws drop with some of the stuff that we receive. But overall, I should also say specifically with feminist in my podcast title, right? So I also realize that by doing that, that's going to happen. I am acknowledging that. I'm putting myself out there as such. But yeah, you learn to use the block button, and you learn to make sure that, or rather to train yourself to pay more attention to the positive emails that you get than the negative ones.
Okay. Tyra, how have things been for you?
I am frequently the only girl at the table. And that's been true since I started. And because also I'm a gamer and I'm an online gamer. So automatically online, people think you're a guy to begin with. Well, they can't think you're a guy anymore when they hear your voice, at least not mine, I hope. We'll find out. But so I've had mostly positive experiences, but I also had a male co-host, and I think he probably shielded me from some of the emails that we might have received from me being a female. But I will say within the podcasting family, I have never felt that from anybody when I've been on a panel or when I've had discussions with people. And I think I've been lucky because I think most women probably do. I'm a little bit older. I'm in my 50s. So I'm a Gen Xer. Nobody knows
Spring
we
chicken,
exist anyway.
spring chicken.
No, nobody knows Gen Xers exist anyway. So I'm just flying under that radar. But within the podcasting community, it's been really wonderful to see more women have a voice, more people of color have a voice, more diversity being out there and talking, because I think that's really what enriches our community. But I have been exceptionally lucky, at least on a microphone. In a game, slightly different.
Right.
I would definitely say I've had it there.
Sorry. My hope is that if we, continue marching through the history of podcasting, hopefully we see a progression that we see that it has expanded as we get further on.
I'd like to bring up real quick just that I think Dawn is, I don't know if it's contended, is definitely the first female podcaster. And I did exactly that to her. I blocked her from everything. I shielded her from everything. We had so many terrible things said in the news and the forums everywhere. So I still, to today, I'll still block that stuff for her.
That's good of you, by the way.
Okay.
Life's too short.
Well, I'm going to switch things up because somebody was asking, I think it's a great question, is, what is your proudest moment in podcasting? And that could be very early on. That could be something that you did. It could be actually getting your podcast out the door the first time, or it could be somebody you met or a comment. Who has a proudest moment in their podcasting career? Yes, Tyra.
So back to World of Warcraft, when somebody actually made a character on our server and hunted us down to tell us that he listened to our podcast. And I just sat there going, what? And then he joined our guild and we ended up playing with him and we're friends with him now. But it was that moment of, oh my God, people are actually listening to us that I don't know. Mm-hmm. But he just walked up to me in game and said, "Leveling Azeroth, I love you." I'm like, it was awesome.
Excellent.
Well, I'm sorry, Drew, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we've had so many awesome moments, but I would have to say I think maybe my most favorite was that we got invited to go tour with Ziggy Marley on these 3 shows in the Baltimore area.
Oh.
And, to also do an interview with them. And so the time came for us to do the interview. We're on this tour bus and it's just Ziggy Marley, Stephen Marley, Damian Marley, and Dawn and I. We're just chilling on this bus, doing an interview. And that was so awesome. So that's probably one of the prouder moments.
And
I would say I had well, Chuck and I both had a moment. It was at I want to say the second podcast expo. No, it may have been the first one. We had a listener from Israel, happened to be in California, and he went out of his way to come down. Abner Braverman, you probably heard, I don't know if you've heard us mention him on the show. He went out of his way to come down to Ontario just to meet Chuck and I. And I'm like, both Chuck and I were like, we're just dudes, but he felt it was important enough that he wanted to come meet us. And that blew me away. And really, I'll say this, because I know Chuck's watching, that starting the podcast with Chuck is probably my proudest moment, because we've had such a great time this last 15 years.
Aw.
It's awesome.
And Sue, I saw
Yep.
you wanted to add something, and I think then Bobby too.
Yeah, I have two that are very, very close. One is the first time that somebody came up to me at DragonCon, in fact, and said, "I recognize your voice from your podcast," which was kind of surreal. And the second one, which is very similar, was just going to work on the subway, looking over, seeing that somebody is listening to my show with like the image up on their phone.
Wow.
And so I have no idea who that person is. So
But thank
that was
you.
very cool.
Yeah, mine is about being able to be invited to things, and it's really early on in podcasting when I was starting, when podcasting was the new hotness. Like video game companies took notice, PR people took notice, so I was going to E3 and other video game conventions and being able to be notable enough to be invited to these things. And there was one game developer conference when I was out there. It was. I think it was. Yes, it was the San Francisco one. Sorry. So there was a game developer conference. We were invited by Electronic Arts to come to their party that night to come see some new Wii stuff, because the Nintendo Wii was coming out about that time, or had just come out. But in there, I got to see this hulking figure in the back, and it was Reggie Fils-Aimé, who was the former president and CEO of Nintendo of America. And this was during the height of Reginator and all that stuff. And I was with another podcaster at the time, and he's like, "I'm going to go get his. I'm going to take a picture with him." I'm like, "Dude, he's working. This is a party. That's not what we're for." He's like, "No, it'll be fine." And I got 45 seconds of Reggie Fils-Aimé's time, and he even lied and said he had heard of me. But I still got his time, and that was kind of just having the podcast gave me that moment, and that's what I really like.
Excellent. Really quickly, mine was first time I got a fan email. It's like somebody actually listened, and it wasn't my family. Amazing. Because by the way, my wife doesn't listen unless she's on the show. So there you go.
Yeah.
My husband doesn't listen.
All right. Well, I wish we had more time. We don't. We're coming up on the end of it. But I want to quickly have everybody give their names, where you can get in contact with you, something really quick. And to mention once again, the history of podcasting, historyofpodcasting.com.
Right.
And you can go there, especially if you're a 2004 to 2008 podcaster, click on a link that you can fill out a form and get some information, do some stuff to say, hey, I'm here and I can share stories just like these awesome stories. Okay, so I'm going to go down the table the opposite direction. So I will start with Drew, and any, way to contact you.
Yeah,
afterwards.
just drewdomkis.com. I've got links to all my other stuff. I do a skateboarding podcast called Skatetosis we've been at for a few years, and that's pretty much what I'm up to. Just skateboarding, living out here in the farm.
Living the dream.
Yeah.
All righty. And Sue.
Yeah, you can find me and my show at womenatwarp.com and at Women at Warp on all of the socials that you care about, hopefully.
Okay. And you can find me, Clinton, at Comedy Forecast, all one word with the number 4. Therefore, you'll never be able to ask for it on any listening device because they think you're asking for weather or something. Working on it. All right. Next, we're going to Bobby.
Right. So my show is the Bobby Blackwolf Show. I am part of and co-founder of the Voice of Geeks Network, a podcast network devoted to all things geek culture, as well as a streaming network. My show is recorded live on Twitch. It's still an audio podcast, but live on Twitch each and every Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, but not this weekend, over at twitch.tv/Fog Network, or you can find me on all social medias at Bobby Blackwolf.
Excellent. Tyra?
TyraBurton.com is where you can find out all about me and my podcast. The Geeky Side and Geek Meet Social should be relaunching soon. I keep saying that, and I have hopes that the pandemic will not kill us. And I'm Tyra Burton everywhere on social media. So.
Okay. And before I go to Craig, really quickly, I want to make sure I get this in. Thank you to everybody in the digital media track for everything that you guys are doing all weekend long. You guys rock. Okay. And now, Craig.
So you can find, I'm a web developer. Nobody wants to watch over my shoulder and see what I do, but you can watch us over at Technorama. So if you go search for Technorama Podcast, you'll find our website. It's at chuckchat.com, and we record Sunday nights at 9:30. And also tomorrow, Clinton and I and Chuck will be here doing our thing. So keep an eye out for that.
4 o'clock, same
4 o'clock.
place.
That's right.
All right. And thank you all for being here. Thank you all for watching, and we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Bye, guys. It was awesome.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
It was awesome. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you.